The sheriff's badge catches the afternoon light as he aims his pistol directly at Eleanor's chest. "Step away from him," Sheriff Garrett says. His voice is steady, but his eyes, those kind eyes she's known since childhood, are stone cold. Eleanor doesn't move. Behind her, slumped against the cabin wall, is a bleeding man she's never met before today. His name is Marcus Webb. He's wanted for bank robbery in 3 territories, and she's just admitted to hiding him. "He was dying," Eleanor says quietly. "I couldn't turn him away." "You harbored a fugitive," Garrett says. Each word lands like a hammer blow. "You aided a criminal. That's treason against this territory, Eleanor. That's—" He stops himself, swallows hard. That's the worst kind of betrayal. The other deputies emerge from the trees behind him. 5 guns. 5 men she's known her whole life, now pointing rifles at the porch of her family's ranch. Eleanor raises her hand slowly. Behind her, she hears Marcus's ragged breathing. She hears the wind moving through the canyon. She hears the moment her life fractures into before and after. "I know what I did, and I'd do it again." Sheriff Garrett's jaw tightens. "Then you know what happens now." But before this moment shattered their world, let me take you back to where it all began. Eleanor Webb ran her family's ranch alone. Not alone entirely. There were hired hands who came and went with the seasons, but the weight of it rested on her shoulders. Her father had passed 3 years prior. Her mother lived in the territorial capital with Eleanor's sister, content to let Eleanor manage the sprawling property in the high country. Eleanor didn't mind. The ranch was hers in a way that mattered. Every fence she mended, every herd she tended, every decision she made was her own. She was 32 years old, never married, with calloused hands and a reputation for being tougher than most men. The town had long ago stopped expecting her to wear dresses or act delicate. Out here, she was simply Eleanor, rancher, survivor, someone the frontier had tested and found worthy. Her routine was solid. Dawn rides to check the herd, afternoons mending fences or trading at the general store, evenings on the porch with coffee and the mountains turning gold in the dying light. It was a quiet life, a good life. Then came the storm. Not rain. Eleanor could see clear sky in every direction. This was a different kind of storm. She'd heard the distant gunshots around midday. 3 quick cracks echoing through the canyon, then nothing. That kind of nothing that follows violence when the world holds its breath. She was riding back from the north pasture when she found him. He was stumbling along the creek bed, one arm cradled against his ribs, blood soaking through his shirt. He collapsed when he saw her, not from fear, but from sheer exhaustion. When Eleanor knelt beside him, she found a bullet wound, recently made, the skin angry and fevered around it. "Help!" he gasped. "Please, they're coming!" Eleanor didn't ask who. She didn't ask what he'd done. She simply got him onto her horse and rode hard for the cabin. That was her mistake, or her mercy. She was never entirely sure which. She set his arm in the cabin's front room. The wound needed digging. The bullet had lodged deep. Eleanor had performed this surgery on injured animals. She'd never done it on a man who was conscious and screaming. She boiled water, sterilized her tools, and worked with steady hands while he gripped the table hard enough to crack the wood. When it was done, she stitched him carefully and gave him whiskey to dull the pain. Only then did she ask his name. "Marcus Webb," he said, delirious with fever. "You shouldn't have brought me here. They'll come looking. They always come looking." Eleanor knew he was right. She should have left him there, should have ridden to town and told the sheriff. That was what the law would demand. That was what civilization required. But something about the way he'd looked at her, grateful and broken and utterly lost, reminded her of something she couldn't quite name. Over the next 3 days, as Marcus recovered enough to sit up and take food, Eleanor noticed strange things. He never asked what she'd done it for, never thanked her profusely or promised to repay her. He seemed to expect her kindness and fear it in equal measure. That was the strangest part, the fear. He'd glance at her sometimes with an expression so haunted that Eleanor found herself wondering what he'd seen, what he'd done. What kind of man gets shot in the back and then looks afraid of his rescuer? "Why did you save me?" he finally asked on the third morning. Eleanor was preparing a fresh bandage. She didn't answer immediately. "Because no one else would," she said finally. He flinched like she'd struck him. That afternoon she was in town picking up supplies. At the general store, the owner, a gossip named Mrs. Patterson, mentioned that the sheriff had ridden through recently asking questions. "Dangerous man passed through these territories, bank robber, killed a man in the capital. They say Sheriff Garrett's already sent telegrams to territories east. This outlaw can't hide long." Eleanor's hands trembled slightly as she gathered her purchases. That night, she asked Marcus directly, "Did you kill someone?" He looked at her for a long time before answering. "Yes," he said, "but not the way they're saying it. And Eleanor," he used her name for the first time, and it sounded like an apology. "You need to turn me in before they find me here, before they know what you've done." She didn't respond, but she knew he was right, and she knew she wouldn't do it anyway. That's when things began to tighten. That's when Eleanor started looking over her shoulder. 3 days later, a horse rider appeared. Eleanor spotted him from the South Ridge, a lone deputy riding hard toward the cabin. She was with Marcus inside, helping him walk for the first time since the bullet wound. They froze at the sight of him. "It's starting," Marcus said quietly. Eleanor made a decision in that moment. She helped Marcus to her bedroom, made the bed to look undisturbed, and went out to meet the deputy. It was Frank Hollis, a good man she'd known since school. His expression was apologetic. "Eleanor," he said, dismounting carefully, "I'm going to be direct. We're looking for a fugitive, Marcus Webb. He came through this territory 3 days ago. There were shots fired near the canyon. We're checking all the ranches." Eleanor's heart was hammering, but her voice stayed steady. "Haven't seen anyone," she said. Frank glanced toward the cabin, then back at her. "You sure? You'd tell us if someone was here?" "I would," Eleanor said. It wasn't technically a lie. She wasn't telling him someone was here. Frank didn't look satisfied, but he didn't push. Instead, he rode on, checking the other cabins and outbuildings. Eleanor watched him, knowing he was thorough, knowing that if he looked long enough, he'd find evidence, a blood stain, a second cup, something. But Frank left after 2 hours, and Eleanor allowed herself to breathe. That night, Sheriff Garrett himself arrived. He rode in as the sun was setting, and Eleanor knew immediately that her reprieve had ended. Garrett was methodical. Garrett was honest. Garrett was the one person in town who could actually catch her. "Eleanor," he said, tipping his hat,
Mind if I come inside?" She should have sent him away, should have made excuses. Instead, she invited him in for coffee, and they sat at her kitchen table while Marcus lay silent in the bedroom, listening. "There's a fugitive in these territories," Garrett said, sipping his coffee carefully. "Name of Marcus Webb, wanted for robbery and murder. I've got reason to believe he came this direction." Eleanor didn't say anything. "I also have reason to believe that someone in this territory has been harboring him." Eleanor met his eyes. Garrett's face was troubled. He already knew. "If I found that person," he said slowly, "I'd have to arrest him. Territory law is clear. Harboring a fugitive is treason. Carries a sentence of 10 years hard labor. You understand that?" "I understand," Eleanor said. Garrett set down his cup. "Then tell me you haven't harbored anyone, and I'll leave you be." Eleanor opened her mouth. This was the moment. She could still lie. She could still protect herself. Instead, she told him the truth. "He's in my bedroom," Eleanor said calmly. "He's been here since I found him shot in the creek bed. I treated his wound, I gave him shelter, and I'd do it again because he was dying, and I couldn't turn away a dying man. Not for law, not for anything." Garrett's face went very still. "Eleanor," he said quietly, "why?" "Because he's human," Eleanor said. "I don't care what he did or didn't do. I don't care what the law says. He needed help, and I had the power to give it." Garrett stood up and called for the deputies. They came quickly. They'd been waiting. 5 armed men entered Eleanor's cabin, and Eleanor felt the walls collapse inward. Garrett himself went to the bedroom and found Marcus trying to escape through the window. It took 3 deputies to bring him down. Marcus didn't resist. He went quietly, with the resignation of a man who'd always known this moment would come. But when they let him out, he looked at Eleanor, and in that look was something that made everything worse. Not anger, not resentment, just gratitude. Just acknowledgement that she'd given him 3 days of safety when she could have given him none. "I'm sorry," Marcus said to Garrett. "This is on me. She didn't know what she was doing." "Didn't matter if she did or didn't," Garrett said grimly. "The law's the law." That's when Garrett turned to Eleanor with his gun drawn. That's when he led her outside. That's when the neighbors began to appear, drawn by the commotion, watching as Eleanor Webb was arrested on her own land. "Eleanor, you're under arrest for harboring a fugitive and treason against this territory. You have the right to remain silent." Eleanor didn't resist. She didn't cry. She simply put her hands together and let them bind her wrists. As they rode toward town, she heard the whispers already starting. Eleanor Webb had betrayed them. Eleanor Webb had chosen an outlaw over her own community. Eleanor Webb had committed treason. She didn't know yet that the real story, the truth, hadn't even begun to surface.
The trial was held 10 days later. The territorial judge came from the capital. The courtroom was packed. Everyone in town wanted to see what would become of Eleanor. The evidence seemed damning. Eleanor's own admission, the blood in her cabin, witnesses who could testify they'd seen an extra horse, an extra cup, signs of occupancy. But then Marcus Webb testified. He stood in the witness stand and told the truth about everything. The bank robbery was real, but it wasn't what they'd been told. The money belonged to a corrupt territorial official who was funding lynch mobs against settlers who wouldn't sell their land. Marcus had stolen it to distribute to the families being terrorized. The man who died had been killed in self-defense, a hired gunman trying to prevent the theft.
"I'm not a good man," Marcus said, his voice ringing through the courtroom. "I've done things I'm not proud of. But Eleanor Webb didn't know any of that when she saved my life. She saved me because she's decent. She saved me because she believed that human life mattered more than law." Then he spoke directly to the judge. "If you're going to condemn her, condemn me too. I knew she was breaking the law. I told her to turn me in. She refused. That makes her guilty of nothing except mercy." But that wasn't what changed the case. What changed the case was the testimony that came next. A woman from the capital, the widow of the man Eleanor's father had supposedly killed in a riding accident 5 years prior. She stood up in that courtroom and explained that Eleanor's father had actually been trying to stop the corruption. He died exposing it. And Eleanor's father had befriended Marcus Webb years before, asking him to look into the officials' crimes. Marcus was gathering evidence when he was discovered. The bank robbery wasn't theft, it was restitution. And Eleanor's refusal to turn him in wasn't about the law. It was about honoring her father's memory, about believing that some things mattered more than territory law, about believing that the law itself had become corrupt. Eleanor sat in that courtroom and wept, not for herself, but for her father, for the years she'd lived not knowing the truth about how he died, for the knowledge that Marcus Webb had been trying to finish what her father started. The judge looked at the evidence. He looked at Eleanor, and he made his ruling. Eleanor Webb is acquitted, on the grounds that the law she allegedly broke was being enforced by corrupt officials, and that her actions, while technically illegal, were morally justified and in service of greater justice. The courtroom erupted. Eleanor left the courtroom a free woman. Marcus Webb was sentenced to 5 years hard labor, reduced from 20 because the judge acknowledged the circumstances of his crimes. He would serve his time, and then he would be free to continue his father's work. Sheriff Garrett approached Eleanor as she stood on the courthouse steps. He said, "I did my duty, but I did it without knowing the truth. I hope you can forgive me for that." "There's nothing to forgive," Eleanor said. "You enforced the law as you understood it. That's all anyone can do." She returned to her ranch, to the quiet routine that had been interrupted by a wounded man in a creek bed. But she was changed. The town was changed. The territory was changed. Eleanor began working with Marcus's organization, the ones gathering evidence against corrupt officials. She used her ranch as a safe house for others like Marcus. She became known as someone who would shelter the hunted if their cause was just. And on the porch in the evenings, watching the mountains turn gold, she thought about her father, about the cost of doing what was right, about the way a single act of mercy could crack open a corrupt system and let the light pour through. She'd saved a wounded outlaw, and in saving him, she'd saved herself. Thank you for listening to this tale here on Frontier Love Tools. Eleanor Webb faced a choice: obey the law or save a life. She chose mercy over law. She chose to believe that some things mattered more than territory rules. And in that choice, she discovered her father's unfinished work. She discovered her own courage. She discovered that treason sometimes is just another word for doing what's right. If you enjoyed this story of sacrifice, justice, and frontier courage, make sure you subscribe, because out here, every sunset hides another story waiting to be told. Stories of women who fought back, stories of outlaws with honor, stories of the difference one act of mercy can make. We'll see you next time.